Hear that? Yeah, that's the sound of you relaxing, because now you're managing diabetes with the Freestyle Libre 3 system. You get to know your glucose levels and where it's headed. Manage your diabetes with more confidence with the Freestyle Libre 3 system. Ready to learn more about the #1 prescribed CGM in the U.S.? Visit freestylelibre.us to learn more. Based on retail sales data for patients' last filled prescription by manufacturer. Refer to the FLAIR NL4 study published in BMJ Open Diabetes Research and Care 2019. Safety info found at freestylelibre.us.
The people at KPMG make the difference for their clients. Talented teams leveraging the right technology to uncover insights that illuminate opportunity. KPMG teams together with their clients, working shoulder to shoulder with them to help grow and transform their enterprise. Are you ready to make the difference together? Go to visit.kpmg.us/transformation to learn more.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Kieran, how are you? It's quite a nice day, which is not making me happy. If it's like this on my walk, Kieran, there's going to be trouble. In nature, or the divine, will fall out of the two slightly disappointing draws for our teams over the weekend, Kieran. But
they were indeed, yes. Yeah, but it's always good to come back and get a last-minute equaliser, regardless of the opposition. So you must have been happy with that. Better than going back to the Porsons on a defeat.
Yeah. Well, I decided not to go back to the Porsons, Kieran, with the new, not drinking regime, not drinking as much regime. And also, it's probably the most sober I've ever seen a game before in my life. It's a completely different experience, Kieran, as you know the sober experience. But one day, Kieran, we need to get into this podcast because it's questions time. But our news pod on Thursday is going to be huge. There's some big news stories coming up on Thursday, including, I know something that a lot of Everton fans are waiting for us to cover, which is their statement about John Textor. There's a funding issue about a new stadium in Northern Ireland, which might affect the Euros, Kieran. But there are two news stories that we absolutely need to cover today. And the first is one we've been eagerly anticipating for many years on this pod, Kieran. The Man City hearing over the 115 charges started yesterday, Monday, which is the day we're recording. And according to various pundits over the weekend, Kieran, there's all sorts of possibilities should Man City, that most unlikely scenario, they be found guilty. Some people have suggested they might be relegated to the National League. Some people have talked about titles being stripped. I think one possibility is the ghost of Malcolm Allison will come down and try and represent them at the appeals. I've seen the Times and the Telegraph both saying today that the rest of the Premier League have called for the ultimate sanction without saying what the ultimate sanction is. Did I say sanction? Sanction.
I think you did. You always said stanchion.
I got caught between sanction and stanchion then, didn't I? I don't know. If Nick DeMarco was involved, that's what would happen. That would be the only penalty. Their stanchions would be taken away for one home game, Kieran. That would be it. I suspect, Kieran, that in 3 years' time we'll be saying, well, they're on to charge 113. And then we'll be on to the appeals and the Court of Arbitration for Sport. This is not going to fly by, Kieran, is it?
No, it's not. We believe that the hearing started on Monday.
Right.
There are various photographers outside various offices in London because everybody is in the know, trying to get a picture of Lord Panic or somebody else who's going to be one of the briefs for either of the two parties to try to get some form of clarification. But as far as the hearing is concerned, the indications is that it will take somewhere in the region of 8 to 10 weeks to process. It could be then, and Stefan Borson, who's a lawyer who also does sort of this type of thing, he's been saying that it's sort of a two-tier approach. First of all, is there an element of guilt? And then secondly, the punishment could be deemed to be a separate issue, and with aggravating and mitigating factors then taken into consideration. So it's looking quite complicated. Even when the hearing has completed its process, you then have to have time to absorb the evidence, and it's a 3-person commission. They will go away and decide on each and every charge. That could take us through to next February or March, and then the announcement comes, and that's that's when the fun really begins.
You do have to say, Kieran, and we are not a cynical podcast. That's our catchphrase. We're not a cynical podcast. But you kind of think if the Premier League managed to balls up one simple charge against Leicester City on a matter of wording, you kind of think that's the level that this is going to be going on at for a long time, isn't it?
Yes, it will be dealt with at a granular level in terms of both the prosecution and the defence. And that's going to extend and expand the amount of time taken in as far as the process is concerned. Ultimately, it will be dealt with in terms of the weight of evidence. It's not a criminal case. In a criminal case, you've got to have proof beyond reasonable doubt. In a commercial case, it's done on the balance of probabilities. So, a 65-35, a 52-48, as we saw in Brexit, is deemed to be sufficient. Whereas in a criminal case, you have to have either all 12 jurors or, sometimes the judge will say 10 out of 12 that they will accept. So there's a different burden of proof. There has clearly been an awful lot of work done, given that it's taken 18 months to get to this particular stage following the Premier League's initial charges, which were levelled at the club.
And presumably, Kieran, I mean, let's say it's Easter before there's any public statement about this. We may all go as just go away and do something, twiddle our thumbs, carry on with a hobby till then, because we won't get any information. This is all going to be completely confidential and in camera, I believe is the official phrase, isn't it? There'll be no, right, this is how it's going after 10 charges, 30 charges. It'll be total silence, won't it, until there's a decision.
That's right, and this will be done incredibly professional. So there'll be no sort of ITK nudge nudge wink wink leaks as you tend to get from the world of politics and also from other elements of the world of football. Our good friend Nick DeMarco has said he feels that there is a good case for having such events open to public scrutiny, because otherwise there could be A, frustration. You want to see how things are progressing, and B, it takes away accusations of bias from one side or another. It'd be great to watch. I don't know if anybody's watched daytime TV recently, but compared to Homes Under the Hammer and a Place in the Sea, I think this could be captivating for fans of football who have got nothing better to do during their daytime.
Kieran, please don't alienate Dion Dublin. It's the last thing we need to happen. Also, if there is a show called Place in the Sea, I'd quite like to watch that. I'd love to see Nick Knowles wading out to his, I was going to say, up to his overinflated ego into a choppy sea off the south coast. This range of sanctions, Kieran, that people have been talking about in pubs and on TV, you've already indicated that some of them are certainly not on the table. It's too early to speculate, but what are the range of sanctions, Kieran? For one, you said that there's almost no chance of relegation, for example. You said,
well, you can't relegate a club during a season because they have to have somewhere to go. So I think we can rule out expulsion rather than relegation would be the phrase they would use there. I think that is highly unlikely because Manchester City season ticket holders have bought their tickets in good faith. Sky would be cheesed off as well. They would be losing one of the key drivers of interest in the Premier League. You then have this somewhat farcical situation that Manchester City could be playing matches in the Champions League, but wouldn't be playing matches in the Premier League. They would, given that any sanction, because it's a Premier League charge, they could be playing in the League Cup. They could be playing in the FA Cup. So that would be somewhat farcical. I think you also have to remember that the Manchester City is a major employer in the city of Manchester. So there are huge unintended consequences if that route was chosen. At the other end of the scale, you could have a financial penalty, but I don't think that would be acceptable to any of the parties, apart from potentially the club itself, in the sense that we saw with the Nottingham Forest Commission hearing that the Commission concluded that what had happened to Nottingham Forest was in effect what they referred to as a minor breach of the rules, which still resulted in a points deduction. Given that the accusations levelled against Manchester City is that the club has misrepresented its financial position. Effectively, it's lied, it's corporate fraud, for want of a better phrase, then that has to be deemed to be a major breach of the rules. And as such, you'd be looking at a very significant points deduction. If found guilty of all charges, 60, 80, 100 points, I think is feasible, which certainly at the upper end of that scale would relegate the club. A 60-point deduction, given how good Manchester City are, that could be touch and go. Then there's the complication of, could the club appeal? My understanding is that the grounds for appeal are very, very restricted, but very, very restricted is not the same as impossible.
Two things there, Kieran, and I appreciate that we will be talking about this for the next 6 months, so we don't want to get too bogged down in detail we don't know about. But first of all, if they were found guilty of what you call corporate fraud, would that then possibly lead to criminal prosecution charges? And secondly, on the expulsion issue, there are people using Glasgow Rangers as an example and saying, look, if this hearing doesn't finish until March, April, when essentially the season is over, so then that does give scope then for the season afterwards to maybe expel them from the league. And that is what happened to Glasgow Rangers in Scotland. They're a similar sized club to Man City in England. So they had no qualms about expelling them from the Premier League, did they?
Yes, I think there's a slightly different scenario there, in the sense that the Scottish Premiership is a single organisation. As we presently have, of course, one of the complications is that the Premier League is independent of the EFL. So therefore, the Premier League could not say, we're going to expel you from the Premier League and you've got to start next season in League Two, as was the case in relation to Rangers. So I don't think that is on the cards. And given the animosity between the Premier League and the EFL, which is very, very clear at present, owing to the Premier League refusing to put an offer on the table in respect of distribution of money, I can't see that progressing any further.
I'm sure, Kieran, I reckon the EFL would probably bend a little and take Man City into League Two just for a season. I think they'd be all right with that, wouldn't they?
It'll be interesting to know on what grounds, because have Manchester City breached any of the EFL's rules?
Fair point. Well, I'll tell you what grounds, Kieran, on the grounds that Disney could make a documentary about called Welcome to Manchester, and everyone could make a fortune and pay off the fine. This next news story, Kieran, about UEFA and the regulator, blew up over the weekend and looks like a huge story. But when you delve underneath, it's not as big a story as the tabloids would seem to indicate, especially those tabloids who are against the idea of a regulator in the first place.
That's right. A letter from the UEFA secretary to Lisa Nandy was leaked to the press. And it did say that there was a concern at UEFA with regards to the regulator and was seeking clarification as to the regulator's remit. And I think this is to do with what we might refer to as mission creep. At present, the focus of the regulator, I think, can be narrowed down to three areas. First of all, protecting the heritage of the football industry, the professional football industry. So in terms of clubs deciding to move grounds, clubs deciding to change their home shirt, their crest and so on, that effectively now would have to get some form of approval from the fan base. Secondly, there would be a beefed up version of the owners and directors test. And thirdly, issues to do with financial distribution, which is seen as a backstop. Now, UEFA's approach appears to be in relation to items 2 and 3 because, and I don't know why this was included. Now, I do know why this was included in the draft legislation. There's a foreign policy clause, i.e., when it comes to who can own a football club, then the regulator must take, and here is the key word, must take into consideration the government's policy in relation to individuals or individual regimes. So if there was a country which was under sanctions from the UK government and that country's sovereign wealth fund tried to take over a club in English football, then the regulator would have to take that into consideration. That's effectively what was the case when it came to Roman Abramovich and Chelsea. The government froze his assets. So this was government interference in relation to the ownership of an individual football club. UEFA didn't pipe up about that. UEFA, remember, banned Russia and has banned Russian teams from participating in its own competition. So that is getting involved in politics on a much broader level. When it comes to the financial distribution, I think it's fair to say that you can see the Premier League's fingerprints all over this. The Premier League is unwilling to give a greater share of its revenues, which are based on the incredible success of the Premier League, to the EFL. And UEFA's concern is that it doesn't want the government wading in because it sees that as being a football issue. At the same time, UEFA's concern is much driven by the fact that it wants a successful Premier League, which is able to generate revenues and be a competitive part of European football as anything else. There is no indication, or in fact, there's no suggestion that the Premier League would have to give up a sizable element of its revenue in terms of this. There has been some whispers, I think, at Westminster that some MPs want to piggyback on the existing legislation to get their own particular views across in relation to some areas, in relation to the running of football. If that was the case, you can understand UEFA's reticence. So this letter has been leaked. It now turns out that a similar letter was sent to the previous government prior to the election. And effectively, it's just UEFA saying, we're okay with what you're doing at present. We just want to clarify a few things. Remember, it's the FA running football. And the FA's turned around and says, we want the regulator. We're quite happy with the regulator. It's only the Premier League which is opposed to the regulator, although the National League, and remember, we're not a cynical show. It has to be stressed. We're not a cynical show. The National League appears to be opposed to the regulator now, and that was by coincidence just after it had announced a deal with the Premier League to have a new competition between Premier League under-21 teams and National League teams.
You remember, Kieran, talking of the last government around the time of the Super League, when Boris Johnson was asked whether the government would get involved in stopping a potential Super League. He'd obviously been well briefed for a change because he said, he started talking about, potential, we can't interfere in football matters and so on and so forth. So we know this is an issue for UEFA and FIFA, and it's part of the way the British press works. You have to get used to this. But even in the Telegraph and the Mail, if you read on to the end of their story about England are going to be thrown out of their own European Championship and this carries on, even in the last paragraph, it says, that the letter goes on to say, I'm sure we can sort this out. You're not going to be thrown out of your own Europe. But again, it just intrigues me that certain elements of the press are as against the regulator as certain Premier League clubs. And I'm not suggesting, Kieran, because for the third time this morning, I'm going to say we're not a cynical show. I'm not suggesting some Premier League clubs have particular links with some more right-wing newspapers. But, clearly those newspapers have an agenda which is as against the independent regulator as some Premier League clubs.
Yes, and a range of views should always be listened to.
Of course.
And I'm in favour of that. My view in terms of the regulator is that I'm a reluctant supporter of the regulator. I would love to be operating in a country where you felt that the game was held in such high regard by the people that ran it, that the much broader issue of protection and heritage and history and sense of identity and belonging were central to the views of owners. But as we've seen with Super League, and as we've seen with Project Big Picture, there is a small cabal of club owners who are not football fans. They are money fans, and they and their cheerleaders in whatever sources will continue to bang the drum that what they're doing is in the best interest of football. What they're doing is in the best interest of themselves. And self-interest goes hand in hand with self-regulation. And this is another of the concerns in relation to the way that we presently have a rule book, which was designed, and must remember, the Premier League is a breakaway competition, just like Super League was. So we can't go harumphing about Super League when we've got our own breakaway competition. And Super League, I guarantee you, would have been as successful financially for those clubs as the Premier League has been for its clubs.
Right. So, Kieran, as I say, our news pod is going to be interesting because we've got two stories equally as big as those to discuss, plus many more. But in the meantime, let's get on with questions. We've got some cracking questions, as always. And our first one takes us to a country we don't visit that often. Beautiful country, Austria. And it comes from Florian Berger. And Florian is a supporter of Austrian club Sturm Graz. And in recent years, says Florian, we've been very successful on the pitch and in the transfer market. 17 million gross profit on the Rasmus Højlund transfer, for example. As a consequence, large crowds are now coming to every home game, and there is the problem. The Sturm still has to share the stadium with local rivals GAK, who are currently playing in the second division. There's just been an attempt to buy/lease the stadium, or at least the right to modify it, and for us to use it exclusively. However, the city of Graz is very reluctant to do anything about it, which means Sturm loses a considerable amount of revenue compared to its domestic competitors. Do you think Sturm could instead build a new stadium in this current economic environment, even without significant funds from local government? And I suppose the trouble there is, Kieran, that a new stadium will take you 6-7 years to build, and the fortunes of Sturm Graz could have changed considerably in that time.
That's right. If we take a look at the present position in relation to the stadium, it's got 15,000 seats, and I think it's got 1,000 standing area. So it's a relatively modest sized stadium. Sturm Graz are the tenant. If you take a look at their Premier League draw, they're playing Sporting, they've got Leipzig, they've got big clubs with big fan bases, Girona and so on. And if they progress beyond the group stage, they'll have some other big hitters coming to the stadium as well. So that has two issues. First of all, what revenue is it entitled to generate during that time? Does it just get ticket sales? What happens in terms of catering sales, hospitality sales, and so on? Do they go to the landlord? As far as the position is concerned, there has been progress. I'm not sure when Florian sent in his email, because as we know, we've got a fairly big waiting list. But my understanding is that there have been talks with the local council, and the decision will be made by the end of this year to go down one of two routes. Either A, for Sturm Graz to have a buyout, and there's no reason why they couldn't buy the stadium and then sublease it on them at the days when they're not at home to the club in the second division. Or secondly, to have a new stadium. I think they're looking at a 20,000 capacity position, and it would be perhaps more geared towards the monetization area of where you can make money from ticket sales. But that decision will be determined by the local council. So it is possible. It's a case of wait and see and abiding by local sentiment, local politics, and so on.
I should be flying over Austria, Kieran, at the end of November. Me and some friends, some old friends, I have to say. It'll be a very sedate time. We're going to Prague. And you know what the first thing I'm going to buy myself for Christmas in Prague, Kieran?
A Dukla Prague away kit?
Absolutely so.
Absolutely. Good man.
And if we have any listeners in Prague, if there's a shop that sells Dukla Prague away kits from the late 70s, early 80s, that's the one in particular
yes,
that I want. A reference that will mean nothing to a lot of our listeners under the age of 40. I'd never waste any opportunity. And again, it's one of those things that I think is hilarious and drives Ali up the wall when every year she says, anything you fancy for Christmas, apart from a Dukla Prague away kit.
In 15th century Florence, the great inventor Leonardo da Vinci dreamt of creating a flying machine, but something kept getting in his way. Admin. Piles of it. Luckily, Leo used the smart buying tools on Amazon Business, so he could work more efficiently. With the extra time, he not only invented the flying machine, but actually built it.
Magnifico! Incredibile! Splendido!
Whoa, easy there, Leo. Amazon Business, your partner for smart business buying.
Our next question comes from Ben Phillips, Kieran. And Ben Phillips says, and again, this is a slightly dated question, but it's an important one to ask. With the Buckingham Group going into administration, do Liverpool or other clubs take out insurance on the loss of income if redevelopment work is delayed, and therefore clubs potentially miss out on the increased revenue from associated stadium works?
Well, for every possibility, there is an opportunity to have an insurance policy. We did see during COVID that those clubs that had business interruption insurance were able to make claims. So there's no reason why we couldn't do something similar in respect of this. Now, what Liverpool would have done at the start of the development, they would have looked at the possibility or probability of such an event occurring. They would have possibly reached out. And my view of Liverpool is that they're a very professional organisation. They would have looked out at the premiums that would have been charged in respect of this happening, and then would have made a commercial decision on the back of that. But there was a delay in the opening of the stadium following the expansion to 61,000. I think it was frustrating from the club's point of view. As to whether they made this decision positive or negative, we'll try and find out.
Jamie Georgiou has an interesting take on a subject we discuss quite a lot. And Jamie says, on a recent show, you talked about players retiring, then potentially joining another club for free. My question is, how long would the club that holds the registration actually hold it for? Is it indefinite, or does the registration expire at the end of the original contract?
You're absolutely right in that latter assessment, Jamie. If you sign a contract, then you hold the registration for X years. Now, if the player formally retires and then returns, and it's not yet expired, then you would be able to claim some form of compensation from the club to which the player has now moved. And this is to stop the farcical situation that a player formally announces a retirement, the host club or the existing club says, "Oh, we're very sorry to lose you," and then a few weeks later they pop up, "I've changed my mind," and picks up a huge signing on fee, and the club that's just lost the player would lose out the rights to a transfer fee. So you could come back. Now, there could be complications. I remember there was a lot of complications in respect of Chelsea, who had a player who they lost because he was found guilty of drugs offences, and that rumbled on from beyond when he formally retired because the club felt that they'd lost out. I think he definitely was a Romanian player whose name I forget.
Mutu.
Yes, right. Adrian Mutu.
Yeah.
These things can have complications, but one would imagine, if a player comes out at the age of 38 to play for his local non-league team in a couple of friendlies or at the start of the season, the club which he previously played for would not be kicking up a fuss.
I mean, Chelsea have got so many players at the moment, Kieran, they could lose a couple down the back of the sofa without noticing, to be perfectly honest, couldn't it? This scenario is almost, it's a much more credible one than it would have been even 20 years ago, just in terms of players who retire through injury. Medical science is so much more efficient now that there is always a chance that a player could have to retire at the age of 28, 29, and then at 30, 31 be ready to come back again, couldn't they? But I suppose in those circumstances, people would be much more tolerant and understanding.
That's right. And there would be additional complications there as well, because it could be, and we've just been talking about insurance in respect of the previous question, it could be that the player themselves has taken out an insurance policy in terms of loss of career earnings due to a career-ending injury. And then if they return and they've received a payment from the insurance company, potentially they might have to pay some of that back. So there's lots of moving pieces in these circumstances.
Question from Alistair Law, Kieran. It's about Scottish football. Alistair rather cleverly has hedged his bets here. So I'm not, again, unfortunately, our waiting list is still so long for questions, which is why you should come to our live gigs and try and jump the queue a little bit. But Alistair says, I am intrigued as to the recent, and in brackets, he puts himself, change in ticket allocation for away fans at Tynecastle. I believe that Hearts changed their ticket allowances for all away fans except Hibs, where they now receive around 640 tickets in comparison to around 3,400 previously. While it's good that they've maintained that figure for the Edinburgh Derby, what sort of financial impact will this have when Celtic or Rangers visit?
Right. Here, I've done this on the basis of the club receiving £25 net. And people say, oh, it's more than that for an away ticket. Remember, there's VAT to take into consideration here. And normally the club selling the ticket might get a small commission for effectively acting as a sales agent on behalf of Hearts. So on that basis, if you reduce that allocation, you're probably talking around about £70,000 in terms of ticket sales. Then there could be, programs, catering income and so on, which might top that up a wee bit as well. Against that, you've got to look at, you always focus on the net position for a club. This is not a criticism of the fans of either Celtic or Rangers. There will be significantly more policing and stewarding required. We've seen already at the start of this season, things have been a bit feisty at the away matches. And then if it's £70,000 of lost income, does it mean that there could be more home tickets sold to replace them? Because, as you know, you tend to have away areas which are individual sections which can be boxed off. So you might be able to replace some of that lost £70,000 through selling more tickets to home fans. And then there's sort of a broader issue in terms of education. Will the residents of Edinburgh, especially if they're children, be missing out if they don't get a particularly interesting interpretation of 17th century Irish history, which is normally proving a significant proportion of the support of the songs sung by those fans?
It's difficult, Kieran, isn't it, for the smaller Scottish clubs? I was watching, I think it's the first game of this season, St Mirren against Celtic, where 80% of the crowd are Celtic fans at a St Mirren home game. And of course, the money is very welcome, but of course it makes it that much more difficult for St Mirren to beat Celtic when essentially every time they play Celtic or Rangers, they're playing an away game on their own ground, aren't they?
That's right. It's a balancing act. We have seen this season more and more Scottish clubs deciding to restrict the allocation to the big clubs, from Celtic, in order to try to give themselves a greater opportunity to have a more balanced number in terms of the fan base behind them. And it has to be said, Celtic and Rangers are box office in terms of their ability to shift units. And from an away fan's point of view, it's frustrating. You get used to seeing your club. I was looking at a comments which had come out from Partick Thistle recently, and they were saying that being in the Scottish Championship, the biggest loss for them wasn't the TV money. It was because they weren't hosting Celtic and Rangers at least twice, potentially, depending on where they finished the season, it could be more than twice in an individual season. And that did have, for clubs which are operating on relatively tight budgets, that does have significant impact on the numbers.
That's really quite significant, isn't it? That losing 4 games against Celtic or 2 games against Celtic and Rangers is worth more than the TV deal in the Championship. That says something compared to our TV deal, doesn't it? Our penultimate question, Kieran, comes from Jude McCarthy. And whereas Alistair Law seemed to show a sort of understanding of our problems with the waiting list for questions, Kieran, I'm afraid Jude McCarthy gets a bit chippy at the end.
Yes.
He gets a little bit chippy at the end, which I was disinclined to ask this question, Kieran, but Jude McCarthy, it's a good name. It's a big club, so I'm gonna ask it anyway. It's an interesting question. Jude McCarthy says, my club, Aston Villa, apparently is planning to spend around £100 million on redeveloping the North Stand, previously known as the Witton End, to increase capacity by 8,000. Now, Spurs' new ground costs between £1 and £1.2 billion. And Kieran has said on the broadcast recently that West Ham, you've said it a lot, Kieran, that West Ham have benefited considerably from their deal to rent the London Stadium. How much extra would West Ham be spending annually if they had to bear the full costs of the stadium, taking into account the original land and build costs, including borrowing costs, repairs, maintenance and upgrades, and of course any amortisation involved? Villa's development will be ready for the 2028 Euros. Is there any chance of an answer before then? Oh, well, 4 years before then. That suit you, Jude? 4 whole years before you? If it was down to me, we would have waited till 2027, but producer guy said I had to grow up. There you go. It's a good question, Kieran, and I know you never like to waste any opportunity to mention West Ham deal.
Yes, West Ham are currently paying around about £3.5 million in rent. Now, it has to be said, for that, they get 25 to 30 days worth of opportunity to call the London Stadium effectively their own. And that means that they're not in a position to generate revenue from the other 330 days. And that could be from concerts, from conferencing and so on. If, however, we take a look at the numbers, if you go to the accounts of the landlord has valued the stadium to itself at zero. And they say the reason for this is because we've committed ourselves on a 250-year lease to lose a fortune every year. The running costs are probably in the region of 17 to 20 million pounds a year. On top of that, Jude mentioned amortisation. Well, the equivalent of amortisation for a stadium is what we refer to as depreciation. On the basis that it's a £1 billion stadium, even if you spread that over 50 years, that's another 20 million. And then you do have the interest on the loans. If the club had to go and fund this, even if you've got a 50 or 60% mortgage at 5% interest, which we've presently got, you're probably talking about another 30 million. So you add those together, you've got a 30, a 20, and another 15 to 20. Probably the running costs would be somewhere in the region of 60 to 70 million, including interest, although your revenues would be higher as well. So on a net basis, West Ham are doing very well. And this helps to explain why they were the only club in the Premier League in season 22-23 to actually make a profit, excluding player sales.
Wow. While we're talking about Villa, Kieran, we should take this opportunity to send our best wishes in regards to the family and friends of Gary Shaw, who are obviously going through a very difficult time at the moment. Our final question, Kieran, comes from Ros Spokes. And it's one of those questions that, again, I love because it's never occurred to me this, but I'm really interested in the answer. And Ros Spokes says, after hearing on the radio that one of our town's rugby players wasn't match fit as he had to spend 4 weeks of pre-season doing jury service, would a footballer be expected to do jury service during pre-season or the actual season, or could he be excused? Now, in my experience, and I've done it twice, and in my experience, you can put it off 2 or 3 times and say, I'm sorry, I'm doing this series, whatever, and they're quite happy. 3rd or 4th time, they just go, no, it's your duty to do jury service. We don't care how much money. So it's a scenario that I quite like, Kieran, the fact that, I'm just Jack Grealish, for example, was not available because he's doing jury service. I don't think they'd make him the foreman, God love him, but it's an interesting. Players are subject to the same civic duty as the rest of us, aren't they?
That's right. Yes, I've done jury service as well. My faith in the legal system, which took quite a big hammering from reading the book The Secret Barrister, took a further very significant dip during the experience of jury service. And I was asked to be foreman of the jury even, simply down to apparently the confident way in which I said the oath. And as an atheist, there's not much of an oath anyway. Okay, well, surely we should have a discussion. No, you sound as if you know what you're talking about. No, I'm just reading. I'm just reading from a piece of paper in exactly the same way as you. I had 11 people look at me, and I was going, okay, right, I'll do it then. But as you rightly said, Kevin, there are a very restricted series of exemptions in relation to not doing your civic duty. They are A, mental disorder, and B, if you have previously been convicted of a crime yourself. There was an interesting case in 2010 in respect of Carl Fletcher. Carl Fletcher was a Welsh international. At the time, he was the captain of Plymouth Argyle, and he applied to the judge to be exempt from jury service on the grounds that he was too famous and there could be repercussions from people who had been charged if they recognised him as a member of the jury. To which the judge's reply, I said, sorry, Carl, A, I've never heard of you, and B, there are plenty of famous people who have sat jury service in their time. There was a letter which had come from the club secretary. This is almost a bit like the letter your mum would sometimes send in to excuse you from doing PE. To say, Carl has a very important match at Cheltenham in the Johnson Paint Trophy next fixture, and therefore we feel that we would be disadvantaged if he was to do jury service. And the judge said, nah, not good enough, mate, do it. To which the player, by all accounts, stormed off and says, I pay my taxes. I don't pay my taxes to end up doing jury service. I think, well, actually, you seem to have your moral equivalence there, I think, is somewhat flawed.
Yeah, I mean, Premier League footballers will be considerably more out of pocket than the rest of us if they were doing jury. So my mum, God rest her soul, when she was asked to do jury service later in life, she wrote back to say that she didn't think she was up for it, psychologically, and she had the foresight to write the letter in crayon. And she got a letter back saying, yeah, okay, we'll tell her. When I did it the first time, the clerk of the court came in to say, have you picked a foreman? And I went, yeah, it's me. And he went, oh, why am I not surprised? As we came out to give our verdict, he whispered in my ear, don't milk it. Thank you, sir. I did it with a flourish, Kieran. Obviously, I left a little pause.
All those years at Strictly.
All those. Thanks to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution to the pod as well, that'd be very kind of you. It'll get you access to our chat community and our regular quizzes. And you can do that by going to patreon.com/priceoffootball. If you'd like a question answered on the show, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. You can follow us on Twitter, X, and you can find us on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to buy our book, which is not quite, it is in one bookshop, but it shouldn't be because it's not officially released for another week or so, but you can pre-order and find details on our website, priceoffootball.com. We'll be back on Thursday with our news pod. I'll probably be knackered because I'll be halfway through my walk. For those of you not being paying attention, I'm walking from Spurs Stadium, accompanied by Gary Mabbott, which I'm very excited about, to Selhurst Park via every ground in London to raise money for the Lilly Foundation, who are leading the fight against mitochondrial disease. If you want to bung me a tenner, you can text on 70560. That'd be very kind of you. In the meantime, I shall hand you over to Mr. Kieran Maguire for his customary farewell.
Thank you, everybody, and also to my big buddy. Good luck. I know it's going to be a long walk, but what you're doing is absolutely amazing, and we're all so proud of you. So keep up the great work. And Uncle Terry sends his regards as well in respect of that. He's walked a few places around London, to put it mildly. He was a postman. It was part of his job, to be fair.
Oh, I was going to say, it's harder for him to walk given the police escort, but I didn't realise
yes.
I didn't realise he was a postman. So that's a handy job for Uncle Terry, isn't it?
Yeah, he used to do. Yeah, he used to deliver and collect.
Of course. Yeah, deliver in the morning, collect a bit later on. Yeah, I know,
yes. Yeah. He always knew who was in. There's various ways you can support the show. As Kevin said, you can come to our live gig. We are in Balham on the 17th of October, Thursday the 17th of October. I believe a few tickets are still available. It's part of the Cheerful Learful Festival. And there's another way you can support us, and that's to give us a review. It helps us in the charts. It helps when we're talking to guests, although I suspect they are completely baffled when they read the reviews. By all accounts, it doesn't matter what you say in the reviews. So you could say you would rather have it presented by Nick Knowles and Yosemite Sam, one of my favourite Looney Tunes characters, and that would be a rootin' tootin' show, which I would listen to.
Oh, he was great. I mean, that was proper small man syndrome, wasn't it?
Yes,
small ginger-haired man with a gun. Why were they allowed to make cartoons like that, Kieran, in those days? Also, talking of gigs, we were in a situation where we'll be doing a gig on the South Coast shortly, Kieran, for a charity that's very close to your heart, and we're just about to confirm the date of that, so hopefully we'll let you know that on the next pod, but it will be sometime in November, so we'll look forward to seeing you in Balham and the South Coast. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The price of football. The price of football.